Chapter 4. Fractured Light. The school bell was a shriek, a metallic, high-pitched assault that tore through Jake's already frayed edges. It wasn't just the sound itself, but the chaotic cascade that followed. The thunder of 100 adolescent feet pounding linoleum, the rapid-fire staccato of locker doors slamming, the cacophony of adolescent voices rising to a fever pitch. He hated Mondays. He hated the crowds, the noise, the way the fluorescent lights in the hallway hummed, a relentless, drilling thrum that seemed to bore directly into his skull, vibrating behind his eyes like trapped wasps. Each light fixture was a blinding rectangle, casting sickly yellow over the already too bright walls, reflecting off polished floors in a dizzying mosaic of fractured light. He just wanted to be home, in the quiet, ordered space of his room where the world made a little more sense, where the light was soft and diffused, and the only sounds were the ones he chose. Today, more than others, the idea of going out anywhere with anyone felt like a physical burden, a lead weight pressing down on his chest. He clutched his backpack straps, his knuckles white, navigating the human currents with practiced, anxious sidesteps. Every accidental brush against another student sent a jolt of static electricity through him, making his skin crawl. He could feel the eyes, the whispers, though he knew most weren't aimed at him. It didn't matter. The sheer kinetic energy of the school exit felt like a physical force, threatening to engulf him. He kept his gaze fixed on the ground, counting the squares of linoleum, a silent mantra against the rising tide of sensory overload. Finally, the blessed, cooler air of the outside. He made a beeline for the familiar blue van, relief washing over him in a wave that was almost dizzying. He pulled open the side door, the squeak of the hinges a welcome, tangible sound against the receding din of the school. John was already there, in the driver's seat, a strained smile plastered on his face. Jake saw it immediately, and felt the familiar tightening in his gut. He knew that smile. It was John's, "I'm about to ask you to do something you don't want to do, but I really need you to try," smile. It meant an impending negotiation, a subtle push and pull, and Jake was already too exhausted for it. He buckled his seatbelt, the click a small, satisfying sound in the otherwise silent vehicle, a tiny victory of order in the chaos. He gripped the buckle, feeling the rigid plastic against his palm. He needed things to be firm, predictable. "Hey, buddy," John started, his voice overly cheerful, a little too loud in the confined space of the van. Jake flinched, subtly. "Shiragami was wondering if maybe you and he could go to Tally's after school, just for a quick bite?" Jake's stomach lurched. The very mention of the name sent a ripple of profound unease through him, a cold sensation that spread from his chest. Tally's. He pictured it instantly. The garish neon sign, the clatter of cutlery, the incessant chatter of patrons, the smell of fried food that always clung to his clothes and hair for hours afterwards. And Shiragami. The thought of sitting in that noisy, brightly lit restaurant, trapped with Shiragami, was enough to send shivers of pure aversion down his spine. Shiragami. He was always too much, too loud, too friendly, too everything. His voice boomed, his laugh reverberated, his movements were expansive. He was a large, imposing man, a shifting, unpredictable force that Jake couldn't categorize or contain. He was a stranger, despite John's insistence, a stranger in their world. A disruptive element in the carefully maintained balance of Jake's life. Jake clamped his jaw shut, his gaze fixed resolutely out the window, watching the blur of familiar houses and trees, trying to anchor himself in the known. "No," he mumbled, the word barely a whisper, but firm. It was a complete sentence for him, needing no elaboration. John waited, then tried again, a little softer, but still with that underlying firmness that Jake detected instantly. "Come on, Jake. He really wants to get to know you better. He even called earlier to suggest we play a game together, like a family thing, to break the ice. A game with Shiragami. The idea was utterly repulsive. Games, for Jake, were structured, with clear rules, predictable outcomes, and quiet concentration. Shiragami's games, he imagined, would be chaotic, unpredictable, filled with booming laughter and forced participation, something he wouldn't be able to control. The thought of that man in their house, in their space, was unbearable. It felt like an invasion. Jake's knuckles turned white as he gripped the strap of his backpack, digging his nails into the thick canvas. "No," he said, his voice rising, a sharp edge of panic creeping in. "No, Tallies. No, Shiragami." He shook his head violently, a tight rhythmic motion. "I don't want to. He's a stranger. He's too much. He needs to go away." His voice cracked on the last words, raw with an emotion John struggled to interpret. John sighed, the sound heavy in the small space. He knew this battle. He'd fought it 100 times, over 100 different things. But this was important. Shiragami was Emily's father, a new part of their extended family, and John, in his quiet way, was determined to make it work. He wanted Jake to have more connections, more people who cared about him, even if Jake resisted so fiercely. He also knew Shiragami was lonely, just like John had been before their families started intertwining. Just as John was about to speak again, his phone buzzed. Shiragami. John glanced at Jake, who was now staring pointedly out the window, his entire body rigid with tension. John hesitated for a moment. Then, with another sigh, he put the call on speaker, hoping that if Jake heard Shiragami's friendly voice, it might soften him. It was a gamble. Shiragami's voice, amplified and cheerful, filled the van. "John, I'm so sorry. I got held up. My car wouldn't start. Maybe we can all meet at Tally's for a quick bite, then head back to play games at the house. I've got a great game of charades. My family loves it." Jake flinched at the sound, his jaw tightening so hard John could see the muscle twitch. He shot John a furious glare, a silent, desperate plea not to agree. John, however, ignored it. He had a plan, a hope, and he was going to see it through. He forced a smile into his voice, though his heart was heavy with the coming confrontation. "That sounds wonderful, Shiragami. We'll meet you there." John ended the call, the silence that followed, thick and suffocating. Jake didn't say a word, but his continued unwavering glare spoke volumes. John started the van, pulling out of the parking lot, the asphalt crunching under the tires. The drive was a blur of anxiety for Jake, each turn of the wheel pulling him further away from the safety of home, closer to the dreaded restaurant, closer to Shiragami. He could feel the panic coiling in his stomach, tightening into a hard, painful knot. They pulled into the Tally's parking lot, the garish neon sign glowing insistently even in the fading afternoon light. The familiar, unpleasant sense of grease and artificial sweeteners wafted towards them. Jake felt trapped, suffocated. Grace and Leo, oblivious to the storm brewing inside their brother, piled out of the van with youthful exuberance. Jake, however, remained rooted to his seat, his body resisting the simple act of unbuckling. His breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. He grabbed his father's arm, his fingers digging in, tugging him towards the steering wheel with surprising strength. "Dad, take me home," he pleaded, his voice thin with desperation, on the verge of cracking. "I can't be here. Take me home, now." John looked down at his son, his face a mixture of exasperation and concern. He gently tried to pry Jake's fingers off his arm. "Jake, we're here. We just need to give Mr. Shiragami a chance." Grace, ever the sassy one, had already circled back to the open van door, attracted by Jake's distress. She saw his rigid posture, his desperate clawing at John's arm, and rolled her eyes. "You're being ridiculous, Jake," she said, her voice laced with the impatience of a younger sibling who didn't understand. "Mr. Shiragami is nice. Why do you always?" The words were like kindling thrown on a smoldering fire. A red-hot wave of pure, unfiltered rage washed over Jake, obliterating the panic, replacing it with a searing heat. Grace's voice, her tone, her complete lack of understanding, it was all too much. She always tried to reason with him, to tell him how he should feel, like he wasn't the one in agonizing pain. He hated it, hated her for it. "Shut the fuck up," he roared at Grace, his voice ripping from his throat, raw and ugly, cracking with the force of his fury. The profanity, so out of character for Jake, hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, followed by an agonizing, shocked silence. Grace's face crumpled, her eyes wide with hurt and disbelief. Leo, who had been quietly watching from a few feet away, stared at his brother, his face pale with shock. John gasped, his hand flying to his mouth, his own face a mask of profound disgust and fear. The shock on his father's face, the sudden vulnerability and hurt on Grace's, the wide-eyed terror on Leo's, it was all too much. The rage dissipated as quickly as it had come, replaced by a fresh wave of shame and self-loathing. He could feel tears, hot and stinging, welling in his eyes, blurring the harsh lines of the parking lot. His chest felt tight, constricted, as if an invisible hand was squeezing the air from his lungs. The feeling of being trapped, misunderstood, and utterly alone overwhelmed him. "I'd rather die than be around him," Jake blurted out, the words ripped from him, desperate and unedited. He didn't care if they didn't understand, didn't care that they were terrible words. He just needed them to know the depth of his despair, the magnitude of his aversion. "I should just kill myself. Then you wouldn't have to worry about me ever again." The words seemed to echo in the sudden, profound stillness of the late afternoon. John gasped again, a choked, guttural sound, his hands still clamped over his mouth. His face crumpled, and he took a shaky step back from the van. "Jake, don't say that," he shouted, his voice cracking with a pain that Jake had rarely heard. "You know, Emily would be devastated if you sent yourself to hell. You'd break her heart so much." The mention of Emily, his fiercely protective older sister, caught Jake off guard. Emily. He loved Emily. Her name, a desperate appeal, hung in the air, stirring a conflicting mix of anger, shame, and an even deeper, more profound pain. He didn't respond, his throat tight, his eyes burning with unshed tears. He knew his words were extreme, cruel even, especially to Grace and his father. He didn't truly want to die, not rationally. But in that moment, in the suffocating trap of the Tally's parking lot, it was the only way he could think to express the overwhelming feeling of being trapped and unheard, of having his innermost, desperate pleas ignored. It was a plea for escape, for someone, anyone, to just listen. John, however, whether out of shock, stubbornness, or a desperate hope that Shiragami would still show and somehow fix everything, refused to take him home. He needed to be strong, to show Jake that he couldn't always get his way by acting out, even though his heart was breaking. He also didn't want to admit defeat to Shiragami, who was supposedly just around the corner. "We're staying here," John said, his voice flat, devoid of its earlier cheerfulness. It was a pronouncement, not a statement open for debate. The walk into the restaurant felt like an endless journey across a minefield. Grace walked a few paces ahead, her shoulders hunched, refusing to meet Jake's eye. Leo trailed behind, casting anxious glances between his father and brother. Jake felt every eye on them, felt the weight of their judgment, though no one looked. He was a creature under a microscope, exposed and raw. They sat uneasily in the empty waiting line, the air thick and heavy with unsaid things. The silence was punctuated only by the distant clatter of dishes and the muffled murmur of voices from the main dining area. Jake kept his head down, tracing patterns on the worn carpet with his shoe, trying to make himself invisible. Each tick of the clock on the wall was a hammer blow against his skull. After what felt like an eternity, John looked around, his brow furrowed with growing concern. "Where is he?" he mumbled, more to himself than to them. "He said he'd be here by now." He pulled out his phone, dialed Shiragami's number, and put it to his ear. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times, before going to voicemail. No answer. John tried again, then a 3rd time. Still nothing. He sighed, a sound of heavy defeat that seemed to sag on his shoulders. The forced hope that had sustained him in the parking lot finally deflated. "Fine," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of its earlier resolve. "Let's just get some food." The food was tasteless. Jake pushed the greasy fries around his plate, the soft, mealy texture of the bun unbearable against his tongue. The noise of the restaurant, already an assault, was amplified by his anxiety. Each clatter of trays, every loud laugh from another table, felt like a physical blow against his already overstimulated senses. He could feel the eyes of Grace and Leo on him, even when they weren't directly looking. He wanted to scream. He wanted to vanish. All he wanted was to escape, to retreat back into the safety of his room, where the walls were solid, the sounds muted, and the light was his own. The drive home was silent, with a vast echoing chasm of unspoken words. Grace and Leo were quiet, their usual chatter silenced by the emotional fallout of the afternoon. John drove, with both hands on the wheel, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the road, betraying the turmoil he felt within. The moment the van pulled into the driveway, Jake bolted. He was out of his seatbelt and through the front door before anyone else could move, driven by an urgent, primal need for escape. He didn't bother with acknowledging anyone. He raced up the stairs, 2 at a time, his feet pounding on the treads, and retreated to his room, slamming the door behind him with a resounding thud that vibrated through the silent house. He buried himself under the covers, a self-made cocoon of blankets and pillows, trying to block out the world. The darkness under the quilt was a welcome balm to his burning eyes, the muffled silence, a sweet relief from the constant hum of existence. He pulled the thick fabric over his head, trying to absorb himself into the mattress, to become one with the quiet, ordered space of his bed. He lay there, hyper-aware of every creak, every shift in the house's old bones. Time stretched, elastic and slow. Just when he thought he might finally find a moment of peace, he heard the soft click of the latch as his door slowly began to open. A sliver of light, harsh and unwelcome, pierced his dark sanctuary. Then the low murmur of his father's voice, hushed and gentle, followed by another voice, deep and resonant. Shiragami's. Shiragami. Here. In his house. In his room. The sense of violation was absolute. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of rising panic and fury. He had thought he was safe. He had thought he had escaped. But they had followed him. That man had followed him. "No," he yelled, louder than intended, the word a raw shriek that ripped from his throat, startling even himself. His voice was muffled by the blankets, but the intensity was unmistakable. "He needs to go away." He thrashed under the covers, a cornered animal, kicking and squirming, desperate to make them understand. His dad's voice, soft and coaxing, tried to penetrate his wall of panic. "Jake, he just wants to talk to you for a minute, buddy. He's worried about you." Worried? Jake didn't want his worry. He didn't want his voice, his presence, his overwhelming everything. "Get out!" he screamed, scrambling further under the covers, burrowing deeper into the darkness. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" Each word was punctuated by a frantic pull of the blanket, as if he could simply disappear into the mattress. The sound of Shiragami's footsteps, soft but heavy, drawing closer, sent a jolt of pure unadulterated rage through him. It was a primal, fight-or-flight response, and flight was no longer an option. He could hear the hesitation, the quiet uncertainty in Shirogami's voice, closer now, just outside the blanket cocoon. "Hey, Jake. I just wanted to check if you're okay." The words, meant to be gentle, sent a fresh shiver of panic and fury through Jake. He knows I'm not okay. He's the reason I'm not okay. He knew he had to get rid of him. He had to make him understand, truly understand, that he was not welcome. With a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline, Jake exploded from under the covers. He lunged out of bed, his eyes wild, his hair disheveled. His gaze immediately locked onto the worn leather belt hanging from the back of his door, the one John sometimes used as a gentle reminder of discipline, but more often as a hanger for his robe. His hand shot out, grasping it, his knuckles white as he tore it from its hook. He held it up, a coiled, menacing whip in his trembling hand, the buckle glinting dull in the dim light. "I'm going to whip you if you don't leave me alone," he screamed, his voice raw and hoarse, a guttural sound that was foreign even to himself. The words were not a calculated threat, but a desperate, unthinking explosion of pure, desperate emotion. The fear in his voice was palpable, overriding any true intent to harm. He just needed him gone. The threat hung in the air, thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket of shock and disbelief. Jake watched, a strange, detached part of him observing, as Shirogami's face, usually so open and kind, paled. He watched as the easy friendliness drained away, replaced with something else, something guarded and wary, a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. Shirogami took a slow, deliberate step back, his hands raised instinctively in a gesture of surrender, or perhaps defense. He looked at John, his own eyes wide with shock. "Okay, Jake," Shirogami said quietly, his voice losing the booming quality that Jake usually hated, shrinking to a subdued murmur. "I'll go." He backed out of the room, slowly, deliberately, keeping his eyes on Jake, who stood panting by his bed, the belt still clutched in his hand. John, his face etched with a profound mix of horror and despair, glanced at Jake, but said nothing, simply following Shirogami out, and closing the door behind them with a soft, decisive click. The adrenaline of the confrontation ebbed away as quickly as it had come, leaving Jake trembling, feeling hollow and strangely alone. The silence in his room was no longer a comfort, but a vast, empty space that echoed with the reverberations of his outburst. He knew he hadn't won anything, not really. He had simply pushed them away, scorched the earth between them, but it was all he could do. He was angry, confused, and terrified at the same time. His chest hurt with a dull ache, and his eyes were still burning. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that settled over him. For the first time since he got home, he was completely and utterly alone. In the hallway, a few feet away from Jake's closed door, John and Shirogami stood in the dim light. John's shoulders were slumped, his face buried in his hands. "I don't know what to do," he mumbled, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I messed up. I thought I was helping." Shirogami, still visibly shaken, ran a hand through his hair. His usual boundless kindness was tempered by a palpable nervousness. "This is beyond what I'm prepared for, John," he confessed, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. He looked at the closed door, then back at John, a deep concern etched on his face. "I'm sorry. I thought this would be a good idea," John said, finally looking up, his eyes red-rimmed. Tears tracked paths down his cheeks. "I just wanted Jake to have more, to be more comfortable around people." Shirogami took a tentative step closer, placing a reassuring hand on John's shoulder. "It's okay, John. These things happen. Sometimes we push too hard, even with the best intentions." He forced a small, strained smile, but his eyes betrayed a deep, unspoken worry. but maybe we should take a step back and reevaluate. John nodded, a slow, weary movement. Yeah, maybe you're right. He buried his face in his hands again, overwhelmed by the situation, by his son's pain, by his own perceived failure. Inside his room, Jake sat on the edge of his bed, the belt still dangling from his hand, a heavy, silent testament to the fury that had just consumed him. The room felt heavy, dense with the echoes of his outburst. He looked out the window, past the dark pane, to the sliver of moon now visible above the rooftops, a fractured crescent against the inky sky. His face was etched with a complex mix of anger, shame, despair, and an unfamiliar, lingering dread. He lowered the belt, letting it drop to the floor with a soft thud. He didn't understand why Shiragami made him feel this way, this profound, visceral repulsion. It was more than just the loud voice or the unpredictable movements. It was a deeper, unsettling sense, a feeling that something about the man was wrong, like a shadow vibrating at the edge of his perception, just out of focus. And for the first time since he got home, truly, deeply, he was completely and utterly alone, trapped in the silence he had so desperately craved. He didn't know, and was too tired to care, that this was just the beginning of something much more terrifying.